Hello there guys, it's Joey, and today we're going to be talking about the Egyptian goddess Seshat. I did look at how to pronounce it beforehand, so hopefully I'm saying this correctly. And this is a requested video, and we're going to be talking about the Egyptian goddess of the written word. So I was really excited when I was asked to make a set for this, which will be at the tail end of the video. We'll talk and discuss things first, so if you're any interested in the discussion, it's fine. We will discuss everything at first, and that's no problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about the mythology, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the personal gnosis side of things. The personal side of the gnosis, just don't mind my nuttiness, but the personal gnosis side of things, we're going to be talking about how I feel about it, how I conduited, how the energies interacted with me, how I interpreted this energy as I was creating and crafting on behalf of another individual who requested spell items for the goddess Seshat. So she is the Egyptian goddess of the written word. She is the female counterpart to Thoth. She's a scribe. She's really interesting in terms of a Egyptian goddess character. Her name literally means female scribe, and she's regularly depicted as a woman wearing a leopard skin draped over her shoulder, and is crowned with a 7-pointed star with kind of like an arch, and it looks a bit like an archer's bow above it. The iconography of this is really fascinating. So to wear a leopard skin over one's shoulder is talking about wearing one's sort of triumphs. The leopard would of course have been one of the predators that may have been foreseen to be dangerous around this time of the year, and so like covering her shoulder with it, the leopard skin was about kind of power, which is really, really interesting. The number 7, with her having 7 stars above her head, was to do with the realm of the gods and their actions, the 7 being completion. The crescent above her head, resembling a bow, could represent dexterity and precision if one interprets it along the lines of archery. Or perhaps divinity, being like a halo. Among Seshat's personal responsibilities within the mythology were record-keeping, accounting, measurements, census-taking, patroness of libraries and librarians, keeper of the House of Life, a celestial librarian, again, mistress of builders, and friend of the dead in the afterlife, which is really interesting. It's that interesting kind of dichotomy that most of her energies are, librarian and bookkeeper and written word and scribe and mathematics and things of this nature, and then friend to the dead. It sounds like a hobby almost. It's like, yes, but I'm also a friend to the dead. I enjoy it. She first appears in the 2nd dynasty of the early dynastic period as a goddess of writing and measurements, assisting the king in a ritual known as the stretching of the cord, which preceded the construction of a building, most often a temple. So that's a really interesting dynamic. She was consulted before the creation, the physical manifestation of a temple. The ancient Egyptians believed what was done on earth was mirrored in the celestial realm of the gods. Seshat featured prominently in the concept of eternal life, granted to scribes through their work. So the written word will grant you immortality, which it's a fairly tried and true method of eternity, as long as your libraries don't get burnt down. When an author created a story, inscription, or book on Earth, an ethereal copy was transferred to Seshat, who placed it in the library of the gods. Mortal writings were therefore immortal. I kind of love this idea that the creation upon Earth was reflected in the other realm, in the realm of the gods, and the creation of the written word, of the kind of open interpretation, the manifestation of soul almost, written for all eternity, was then transferred into the realm of the gods, and it became like a symbiotic relationship. I love this idea. I think it was really, really interesting. Seshat was also sometimes depicted helping Nephathias revive the dead in the afterlife, in preparation for their judgment by Osiris in the Hall of Truth. In this capacity, the goddess would have helped the new arrival recognize the spells of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, enabling the soul to move on towards the hope of paradise. And that's really, really interesting. The kind of opening of the spell book, the needed incantations for a soul to move on, the needed knowledge, the needed prayers, the needed spells in order to move on in terms of the cyclic nature of the soul. Fascinating stuff. I love Egyptian mythology. Unlike the major gods of Egypt, Seshat never had her own temple, cult, or formal worship. Owing to the great value Egyptians placed on writing, however, and her part in the constructions of temples in the afterlife, she was venerated widely English through commonplace arts and daily rituals from the early dynastic period to the last dynasty to rule Egypt, the Ptolemaic, I'm going to guess it's Ptolemaic dynasty of 323 to 30 BCE. Seshat is not as well known today as many of her other comrades, other Egyptian gods and goddesses, but in her time she was the most important. That's arguable. She was among the most important and widely recognized of the Egyptian pantheon. Was there anything else I wanted from this? They're talking about Thoth there. It's debated whether she might have been related to Thoth, whether or not she was married to Thoth, whether she was a consort, or there's some push and pull. I think that was it for that, unless okay, we will touch on this though. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed a level of equality unmatched in the ancient world. It is well substantiated that women could be and were scribes, in that we have a name of female physicians and images of women in important religious posts such as God's wife of Amun. Both these occupations required literacy. Egyptologist, such an amazing job. I would love to have been an Egyptologist. Joyce Tildesi writes that among the only Egyptian women to be depicted actually putting pen to paper was Seshat, the goddess of writing. Several ladies were illustrated in close association with the traditional scribe's writing kit of palette and brushes. It is certainly beyond doubt that at least some of the daughters of the king were educated, and the position of private tutor to royal princess could be one of the highest honour. It is, for example, known that the female pharaoh oh goodness, these Egyptian names, don't know, hired a tutor for her daughter Neferu Ra, and the Queen Nefertiti was illiterate, as was her mother-in-law, Queen Tai. Still, when it comes to the majority of women in Egypt, images and inscriptions leave some doubt as to how many could actually read and write. Anyway. As noted, although Seshat never had a temple of her own, she was the foundation of the temples constructed in her role as mistress of builders, and her participation, it was nearly Rocky Horror Show, participation in the ritual ceremony of stretching the cord, which measured the dimensions of the structure to be raised. The floor of the temple was laid out through the stretching of the cord ceremony after an appropriate area of land had been decided upon. The rite involved careful orientation of the temple by astronomical observation and measurement. So this is another thing that comes into the energy of Seshat quite strongly, is kind of like this astronomy and this kind of it's completely gone from my head. The other one. Astrology. There we go. Astrology and astronomy are associated with the goddess Seshat. Apparently this was usually accomplished through the sighting of stars, through a northern circumpolar constellation, through a notched wooden instrument called a maquette, and thus acquiring a true north-south orientation, which was commonly used for the temple's short axis. According to the texts, the king was assisted in this ritual by Seshat, the scribal goddess of writing, and measurement. So there we go. So there we have some really interesting tidbits about Egyptian mythology, about the goddess herself, about the kind of gender roles and things. So the first thing of note, which is kind of a shame really, is kind of like the fact that she was a goddess of writing, and yet her legacy is largely lost. Like, this is like one of these great shames of history, one of these great ironies and sadnesses, really, that the goddess of writing and measurements and buildings and temples didn't have a temple of her own, wasn't recorded very well. And she was a major goddess in the dynasty period, as described, but yet the information about her is minimal. And I was like, there's something really sad about this, especially given the importance placed on documentation and writing by the Egyptians. So the Egyptians are a very different energy to them than, say, like the Celts and the Norse, because the Celts and the Norse didn't believe in writing things down a lot of the time. They were largely oracular, and to the Celts, like the magic of these things was lost if they wrote them down. However, the Egyptians did not ascribe to this mentality whatsoever, and obviously the hieroglyphs, I cannot speak today, I don't know what's the matter with me. The hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt are well documented and preserved in a lot of museums that you can go see, and it's very, very interesting about their language and the way they gave importance to language and recording of history and events and things of that nature, which also makes life slightly more easy for the historian who has that kind of material to work through. Also, they place this importance on writing because of this celestial chord that goes on. You have what happens on earth is mirrored in the heavens, and there is no separation. So it's a really beautiful visual image of somebody writing or scribing history or mathematics or whatever it might be, and then there's a celestial counterpart that is being created at the same time. I just have this image of this huge library and like little books writing themselves. It's a little bit Terry Pratchett maybe, where books are alive and magical and have personalities of their own, and they're being created. And if you've never read a Terry Pratchett book with a library in it, you need to. It's the best bit as far as I'm concerned, other than the witches. I'm sure Seshat wouldn't mind me talking about books in her thing, in her video. So this celestial library, this celestial collection of information, shows through the mythos how important the written word was in spiritual and my words are just, this is, I think I'm being mocked. Words are just going out of my head. So they placed an importance on the sacred, on the spiritual, on the rites, and as we know, the Egyptians had a very popular, very immortal way of interacting with death and death rites and death rituals, and they had the Book of the Life and Book of Death, and they had very strict observances and ways of people getting into the afterlife, and there was a very large portion of their spirituality was centered around the kind of quest for immortality after death, and then immortality of the writing, of course, then ties in. So it's very interesting that Seshat has a position twice over, which is to do with immortality and making sure that humans gained their kind of immortality where it was merited. So those that had written things that merited being in the heavens became immortal in the heavens, and those that souls that were merited becoming immortal through Osiris, and that sort of soul's reincarnation is paradise. She made sure that they knew the rites and the rituals that they needed from the Book of the Dead. So it's a really interesting dichotomy there, if you like, or like at least two elements, two aspects of her personality. And I feel very much like she was a friend to humanity. She lent her power to humanity. She was invested in humanity, and this is true with things to do with measurements, mathematics, astronomy, and the celestial bodies. She created an understanding, she created a connection between gods and man, very much so. Like, she had this place in between them where the written word, the spoken word, was a connection of communication. And I feel like that was really, truly important to this goddess's energy, this interweaving, whereby she wanted understanding and she wanted immortal knowledge to be maintained. This beautiful energy of this connection, this bonding between mankind and gods, this retelling, and the importance, of course, of the written word and stories and documentation. Scribes are interesting in Egyptian mythology. They held a high place of honour, so again we're a little bit different from other variants that we frequently cover on the channel. It's also interesting, however, that she didn't have her own temple. I'd like to know why. I couldn't really find anything. There was just documentation of, that didn't happen, and we can make arguments about, oh well, maybe it was a female thing and a female scribe thing, but then the other goddesses, Sekhmet was a war goddess, a female war goddess, and Bast has temples and things to her living on, and obviously goddess Isis, and they still have documentation. So if it's not a gender thing, unless it's a gender thing in that specific role, it's a really weird quirk of history that, I mean, maybe it's that they just didn't survive. That's possible. Maybe the documentation of it didn't survive, which would be ironic, unless it's upstairs in the heavens somewhere. It's one of these weird, weird things, and I was like, that's slightly bizarre to me, and I just, it's a strange thing, and I couldn't really. I was looking around it, and I couldn't find any information as to why she didn't have a temple or a cult of her own. It seems strange to me, especially given that she has a role in the afterlife, with the Egyptian emphasis on the afterlife and all the rituals and spells, and the Book of the Dead being perhaps the best known death book of the Dead. Inscriptions and spells for immortality and things. You can argue with it's not the best known, but I think it's probably the best known. It's a strange thing. Anyway, when interacting with her energy, the set was asked for certain colours and feelings and themes and things, but there was kind of like this emphasis when working with her that it became a little bit like the ritual of the cord, and the ritual of the cord is observing the astral heavens when creating buildings. So when creating like physical items for her, it felt very much in this same vein. It felt very much like observing the stars and bringing that down into a physical, tangible thing. And working with her in meditation, there was always these like moving heavenly bodies, these moving stars, and then kind of like temples underneath. It was often images of temples by night, because you can see the stars more clearly, presumably, and the constellations, and you can get your bearings and draw up lines and things. She also has this very strong energy of the sanctity of the recorded, like keeping a record, keeping a tale alive. And maybe that's why we actually came to this point where we're talking about her, because it's keeping her energy alive, even though that the kind of documentation has gone awry a little bit from ancient Egypt. Maybe the documentation we now create can help address that balance a little bit. Maybe. Who knows? But there's definitely that kind of astral connection between the heavenly bodies, the heavenly realm, and the earthly realm. So there's that noble stars, humble earth energy coming into the goddess Sishat's products, very much so. I think we'll show the products now. And first and foremost, we have the spell oil. I'm going to apologise for the lighting, because basically now we're in the depths of winter. I'm working with this light, which should hopefully be better, but it's not natural light. So, that's not too bad. That is not too bad. There we go. Can we focus a little bit on the bottle itself, please? Please? There we go. There we go. So, the feeling with Egyptian goddesses and gods as well in general is there is definitely a particular vibe that comes through when it comes to ancient Egypt. So there's an exoticness to me. Now this is because presumably because it is so exotic to me in this incarnation anyway. There is that spice in the air kind of feel. There's that long sands kind of feel. There is that kind of Nile flood kind of feel. So this energy comes up with Egyptian gods and goddesses in general and is present and prevalent in all of the god energies. This comes up into the goddess Isis stuff. It's come into the Bast stuff, it's come into the Sekhmet stuff, and so on and so forth. So it definitely came into the Seshat stuff. But there was like this honouring of this desert and this sense of spices and the Nile by night and that kind of lapping energy, but also like creating things in that darkness, bringing down that heavenly energy. Things had to align correctly. There was a very sort of structured approach. It wasn't flimsy, it wasn't airy-fairy, it was very structured and very rigid, but not to the point of being outside of the heavenly bodies. It was rigid in so much that the direction of the things to make sure that they are lasting comes into that. The way that words interplay in the correct order, otherwise they're nonsense. And the way that foundations have to interplay in the correct order or they fall apart. So there we go. Then we have the spell cauldron. The spell cauldron itself is a reflection of the heavens above. And looking at things through an archaeological perspective is very much looking and drawing down the astral body in order to create. There is the golds and blues throughout, as was requested. These are colours that the individual felt associated with her. There is that kind of regality to it, of course, that very strong Egyptian goddess feel. They work really well in these colours. So with the spell orb, you have like the midnight sheerness. You can imagine her wearing a robe of sheer night. At least I can. The crescent moon was one of her symbols as requested. And then within the spell orb itself, we have created papyrus recordings, as though in her great hall or library. And then with, again, there we go. There we go. So that is it for the Goddess Seshat. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there are any further questions, feel free to pop them down below. And many blessings.